All right, beautiful. Lovely to see you all this morning, and a beautiful Monday morning. So, what I'd like to do today is we're going to dive into modal logic. And the aim for this week and next week is going to be to focus on this formal language. Well, so here's something kind of neat. Basically, today and a week from today, I'm going to teach you a new formal language. It's very close to one we already know, but technically it is a new one. And then 4 different natural deduction systems. They're really, really, really similar. Each differ by like 1 rule. But importantly, what it is it gives us a tool to start thinking about something that we haven't actually been able to cover up until this point. We've been sneaking it in, but I bet you guys didn't even notice. So here's the plan. We're going to start off by talking more generally about the concept of modality. In particular, a notion that I'll sometimes call elethic modality. More on what exactly that is in just a second. But this is really going to be our stalking horse for this week and next week. And it's helpful for us to get a kind of grip on the broad concept before we dive into thinking about a formal language to capture it, or a natural deduction system to let us do some proving with regards to it. But our big aim, as well as getting a grip on modality, is for today, be able to prove some stuff about modal logic, and for next week, we're going to build what we'll call interpretations. I also want to stress, they are not the same as the horrifying, terrifying things that you guys did at the end of the last block with regards to FOL. So they're not interpretations in that sense. Instead, you can almost just think about them as kind of maps of possible situations. So that's what we'll be doing next week. But first, we're going to go through the modal logic, natural deduction. And our plan is going to be first to kind of get a grip on this broad idea of modality, especially alethic modality. I'll then introduce this formal language, ML. And then we'll go through 4 natural deduction systems that are building in strength. So that's the kind of plan. We'll see how it goes. Given the kind of topic for today and how I sort of figured it would work best, I think it'll be most helpful if we kind of go for a bit and then take a break and then come back, if that's okay. Just because it'll be good for us to kind of pause, get a breath of fresh air, make sure we're all okay. We'll exactly see where that happens depending on how it all goes. But that's the plan. So let's start by doing some kind of pre-logic philosophy. And think about this notion of modality. So modality is really deep and really baked into so much. But the place to start is with modal claims. Modal claims are claims that aren't usually just about what's merely the case or what's merely true, but rather what must be the case or what could be the case, or perhaps what should be the case. That's also another sense of modality. So the idea here, right? Take my sweater is black. Now, obviously that is in fact false, but there's a sense in which it could be the case. It wouldn't be very hard. I could even go to Jumbo and get myself some dye and very cheaply and badly, and probably end up dyeing my skin everywhere, make this shirt black. So there's a sense in which my sweater is black is false, but it could have been true. Same thing with my sweater is gray. But what about my sweater is a sweater? That one has a kind of slightly stronger feeling. Like it's the case, it's obviously true, and it obviously could be true because, well, it is true, so that means it could be. And there's a sense in which almost it feels like it must be true, in a very weak sense, in that if my sweater exists, well, given what it is, it's going to be what it is. Now we could debate that. We might think that maybe a wizard could come along and turn this into a whale, whatever. But the important idea is we can start to get a little feel of a difference here. And then finally, if we take our last one, my sweater's a flying nuclear-powered wombat, right? That's not just false, but that seems like it couldn't be true. That looks like it's just a bad mistake, right? It's not just false, but it must be. And again, maybe we could play around with that. Again, if we've got wizards, all bets are off. But we can start to feel the difference here, right? There's things that are actually true. There's things that are necessarily true, that must be true. There's things that could be true, could be false. This is all kind of stuff you talked about way back in the very first lecture. But what's interesting about these modal claims is that they're everywhere in philosophy. So you have stuff like ought implies can. Have you guys heard this already? So the basic idea, right, is if you ought to do something, right, if you're morally required to do something, then it must be such that you could in fact do it. You can't be required morally to do something that is literally impossible for you to do. That's beyond your moral requirements. So note, that already involves a sense of possibility. Ought doesn't imply does, right? Not everybody does the right thing, but ought implies can. You could have done the right thing. Another one that'll come up in philosophy of mind, right? Take the mind could exist without the body. So presumably everyone's also studied Descartes, right? You guys talked about Descartes already. There's a version where you read Descartes where he's not just saying something epistemic, like, oh, I can kind of think maybe the body could be different from the mind, but he's literally making a metaphysical claim. He's saying, hey, this mental thing could exist without the physical substance. Note, again, that could, that could there is this notion of modality. It's not that it does, because, we're all meat bags, but it could. And these are just two quick and dirty examples. Run through a bunch. Think of any time you come across a philosophical claim that says something must be so, or that it could be so, or that it leverages a could be to then tell you two things are different. All of this is hinging on this idea of being able to make modal claims. So, modal claims usually aren't just about what is the case, but about what must be or what could be. Put another way, modal claims concern modes of truth or falsity. And these are modes you've already talked about. So you have something like being necessarily true. That is not just true, but couldn't possibly be false. Must be true. And it's hard to figure out what exactly falls in here. But we know some things that will. If we go back to some of the definitions we talked about in the first block, right? What are some sentences that are going to fall as necessary truths? What are some sentences that turn out to be necessary?
Tautologies.
Tautologies are one. Do you remember any others? So what's the kind of correlate to tautologies for first order logic? Do you remember what those are called?
Contradiction.
So that's the other one. Those are the ones that are always false. But what's the kind of parallel with tautology when we think about first order logic? Do you remember?
Theorems.
Yeah, close. So that's natural deduction. Nice thing is theorems are also going to be necessary truths. They're provable necessary truths. I'll help you out, right? So logical truths, right? If you remember, logical truths. Those are FOL sentences true in every interpretation. Logical truths are subtypes of necessary truths, just like theorems, just like tautologies. It's a way of being true that isn't just, oh, you happen to be the case, but you're locked in as being true. Contrast that with necessary falsehoods, or being impossible, right? These aren't just false, but they have to be. Contradictions are good examples, right? There's no valuation or no interpretation that makes them true. And then in the middle, you have the vast swath of sentences that are contingent. They could be true and they could be false. Note this sense here, this modifier. the could. That's already highlighting that we're talking about a modal claim. This claim isn't in fact true, but it could have been. If the schedulers hated us even more, they could have started us 2 hours beforehand. Yay! Again, we see the kind of idea here. Make sense? Okay. Yeah.
So necessarily falsehood and truth are also modal claims?
Yeah, right? So being necessarily true is a mode of being true. Being necessarily false is a mode of being false. So you can sort of see a modal claim is, this is necessarily true. Necessarily 2 plus 2 is 4. That would be a modal claim. The sentence itself, 2 plus 2 is 4, will have the status of being necessarily true, have a modal property.
But isn't everything a modal claim then?
Nice! So, in some sense, yes. Right? But note that we're not always interested in the modal properties of a sentence. We might just be concerned with whether it is or isn't true. What we get into when we start to think modality is, oh, okay, cool. If it is true, does it have to be true? Must it be true? Or is it merely contingently true? That's where we start getting into the modal stuff. So it's that additional step forward, where we're not just concerned with what's actually the case, but what could be. Here's something really cool. Again, let's go back to the very beginning, the first lecture. What's the deep, dark kind of property that we're really interested in? What was the first definition on the midterm? The most important notion, validity, right? What's the key concept in validity? What's the definition of validity?
An argument is valid if and only if it is impossible for all the premises to be true and the conclusion false.
Nice, right? Note the special word that happened right in there. Impossible, right? We're invoking modal notions even at the very core of what we're after when we're thinking about validity. It's not just that it happens to be such that the premises are true and the conclusion's also true. It's that it's impossible for us to flip the premises on while the conclusion's still off. It's a modal connection. Nice. Okay. So, here's something nice, right? This general idea of modality. It comes in lots of different flavors. There's lots of different strengths of modality. Or to put another way, there's many different senses of interconnected possibility and necessity. So if we focus on necessity, we can talk about the Hulk necessity, the strongest there is. Or we might go down to weaker ones. So the thought here is that we can think about different grades of what's going to be possible or impossible. Easy example. For those of you who read the textbook, Rob, my friend who wrote it, wrote the primer. I love Rob. Rob is very chunky. So it's not really possible for Rob to run, he talks about running 100 miles an hour. It's not possible for Rob to run 25 miles an hour, right? It's just not possible in the sense that given how Rob actually is, he can't run that fast. But no, it's of course physically possible. If we got Rob tuned up, or maybe just sort of, he talks about cutting his legs off and replacing them with robo legs, we could get him to run 25 miles an hour. We could get him to run 100, potentially. There's nothing physically preventing it. And there's certainly nothing logically preventing it. It's not like it'd be a contradiction for Rob to be running at over 100 miles an hour. So we already get a sense of kind of grades of possibility there. There's a real possibility, taking things as they in fact are, taking the laws of physics as they actually are, taking logic as it gives it to us. It's not possible for Rob to run at 100 miles an hour. But there's another sense of possibility, physical, nomological. This just means according to the laws of nature. It's nomologically possible for Rob to run that fast. It's certainly logically possible. We see the idea here. On the flip side, if we think about things that are necessarily true, so let's say 2 + 2 = 4 is a logical necessity. It's not just kind of true in virtue of the laws of nature, but it's true simply in virtue of what the identities of 2 and 4 are, and how addition works. Well, in that case, if it's a logical necessity, logic gives it to us. If it's a tautology or a logical truth, it's also going to be nomologically necessary. The laws of nature aren't going to let us violate 2 + 2 = 4. And similarly, if we think about what must be the case given the way things actually are, in the same sense that, Rob couldn't run 25 miles an hour, well, then it must also be the case that 2 + 2 = 4. Again, what we have here is a kind of concept of different grades of modality. At the top, you have logical, and it gives you a very narrow cone of necessities, very few, but massive ranges of possibility.
Just to clarify, the possibility is kind of the could, and the necessity is the must.
Is the must. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So possibility is could, necessity is must. It has to be. So again, when we think about logical modality, it's going to give us a very narrow range of necessities, basically only the tautologies and logical truths. And then when we move to the next layer down, as it were, and take, again, this nomological sense, we take the laws of nature as fixed. Well, cool, we're already automatically getting a bunch of new necessities because we're holding the laws of nature fixed. And of course, everything that conflicts with them is going to turn out to then be impossible. So there's a big swath of logical possibilities that get ruled out because we've fixed the laws of nature. So the range of possibility gets narrower. And then so on down, as we fix the way things actually are and invoke a kind of real sense of possibility. Well, cool, a whole lot more will be necessary and a whole lot less will be possible. But we have a very cool relationship here. Everything that's necessary in the ones at the top will be necessary in all the weaker ones down. And everything that's possible in the one on the bottom will be possible all the way up. Again, you can kind of think about this as a big space. And when we're locking in the logical necessities, it starts to darken some of the space. And then as you move down, you lock more into necessity, and more possibilities get excluded from you. But if something's possible even at the bottom, it's possible all the way up. So the thing to take away here, not so much worrying about the different degrees, is just that there are different senses. And the modal logic that we're going to introduce is actually able to track all of these different senses. You have to play around with it a little bit, but importantly, the general formal system is compatible with us paying attention to any of them. So before we move on, I'm going to pause, ask, what questions do you have for me on this so far? Yeah.
Is there a real necessity that isn't a logical necessity? Do you have
Yeah. So again,
example?
Rob's not being able to run 25 miles an hour. He's a fat man. Well, take me, right? I certainly can't run 30 miles an hour. So if I can't run, it's not possible for me, then it must be necessary that I don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's a real necessity. But it's certainly not a logical necessity. It's possible logically for me to move that fast. That's the kind of shift here. Another very silly one. Everyone who had breakfast this morning, right? It's really necessary that you had breakfast because you can't go back and change the past. Past is fixed, So historical facts will turn out to be necessary on this real sense of necessity. But there is absolutely a sense where you might have not had breakfast. For many of us, it's a very close possible situation, right? So there's plenty of things that will be nomologically possible, compatible with the laws of physics, and yet still, strictly speaking, really necessary because, well, given the way things did work out, they have to be true in that sense. Cool. Good question. Sorry. I saw the pen. I'm saying so. Yeah.
Nomological is according to
Laws of nature. So literally nomological just means according to the laws. So you can think about this as something like physical necessity. You'll sometimes see, start again. There's logical necessity. Then the middle one is sometimes called physical necessity, because again, it's the laws of physics. And then this bottom one you sometimes hear as like real possibility or real necessity, or even just actual possibility, though that's a terrible phrase. Again, this is more thinking about, this bottom one is like, given how everything in fact works out, what's really able to us? Yeah.
I may have missed it. Could you give an example of the logical necessity?
Yeah. So it's hard to think of some, but the best ones are going to be anything that's a tautology and anything that's a logical truth. Importantly, when it comes to logical necessities, it's almost going to be in virtue of their logical form. So a very silly one, but one we'll talk about in just a second. There you go. That is a beautiful logical necessity. It's not super informative, but one of the things you'll find out is that a lot of times logical necessities don't really get you very far. Which makes sense, because logical possibility needs to be extremely likely. Okay, so this is the kind of philosophical thing lurking in the background. We have these different senses of possibility and necessity, effectively different modes of truth propositions can have, and they come in degrees. Right? They come in different flavors and types. And our modal logic is designed, in theory, to capture any of them. Now, notably, one of the things that's going to happen, and this is interrelated to the stuff we'll do near the second half of this lecture today. One of the reasons why we have to have a bunch of different natural deduction systems is because, at least in theory, these different senses might behave differently. That is, what's going to be really necessary might logically operate slightly differently than logical necessity, setting aside this kind of relationship. A thing to note, though, in every single case, is that it's still having to do with modes of truth. So this is why you'll sometimes read or hear talk about alethic modality. Have people heard that word before? Alethic? So it literally means having to do with truth. Aleth is true, right? A truth. So alethic having to do with truth. And again, that's sort of what we're interested in here. The contrast is meant to be something like epistemic or possibly moral. But we'll talk about that a bit. Okay. So that's the big kind of philosophical thing in the background. Here's something really weird. Even though, impossibility was a core part of what we're interested in with our formal system, nothing we have taught you so far actually lets you express the notion of impossibility. If you think about how would we say, right, how would we express a sentence like this in TFL? How would we do it in TFL?
It is or it isn't.
Well, so that's true, but note that it is or it isn't is a very different claim than possibly my sweater's black. It is or it isn't looks like a necessary truth, and I'm not really sure that my sweater's being black is a necessary truth, given that it's not black.
B for my sweater's black, and conclusion. C for my sweater's any other color.
Cool, but note then what we're saying is something that could not, or at least if we read this sentences the right way, shouldn't be true. Because that would require my sweater to be black and every other color. Yeah, nice, but that's basically what your man said a second ago, right? And that's a necessary truth. But it doesn't really see that my sweater's black is a necessary truth. It's not a tautology. Do you see the problem? So the problem is basically, we do not have a tool yet to express this. The closest we can come is something that's going to be truth functional. But every way that we try and capture this truth functionally is going to give us the wrong conditions. It's not going to line up with what we intuitively think we should say here. So modal logic is going to give us tools to let us say stuff like this. Specifically, it's going to give us operators to express possibility and necessity, the musts and the cans. So, let me introduce you to ML. Modal logic, our third and final formal language. It's very similar to TFL. In fact, it just is TFL with two extra things bolted on. And, as we'll see in a second, a slightly different natural deduction system. So there's four kinds of symbols that make up ML. You have atoms, and they work just like they did in TFL. So they're capital letters with subscript. So we have an infinite number if we need them. We've got the 5 connectives, just like we did before, and they work just like they did before. We have brackets. You know how these work. You've been playing with them already. The last thing we have are our 2 modal operators, a box and a diamond. We're rich. So we can say, just like all the previous instances, right? We'll say an expression of ML is any string of these symbols. So write them in any order you want. But much like with TFL, not every expression is going to be a sentence. Or, having worked on my Dutch for quite a while now, as I'm very familiar, not every string of Dutch words is going to give you a Dutch sentence, right? You've got to have some grammar rules. So, what's the grammar rules for these? Well, let's get a run up to it. And let's think about what our box and diamond say. And then we'll talk about the grammar rules. So the box and diamond can express many notions. They're just logical operators, so we can read them as whatever we want. But we're going to read them because we're interested in modality. The box is going to express is necessarily that. So box A, note it's in my sexy swash font, so it can be any sentence we want it to be. So box sexy swash font A says it's necessary that sexy swash font A. And then the diamond is going to be our possibility operator. So diamond sexy swash font A, it's possible that sexy swash font A. Some things to note grammatically. Grammatically, they operate in the same way that negation does. So that is, you stick them on to a complete sentence. You'll never stick them in between two sentences, like conjunction, disjunction, the conditional, or the biconditional. Again, they're like negation in the basic grammatical function. Also like negation, you can stack them. Right? You know how you can write like that? Not A? Well, cool. We can stack these operators. Go crazy. Intermingle them. Put a bunch of boxes in front. Put a bunch of diamonds. Put a combination of boxes and diamonds. That's going to be okay. That's what this says. We're going to talk about what it means in a minute, but right now we're just talking the grammar. We're just talking the grammar. So understood, ML allows us to capture the stuff that we couldn't say before, right? So I can say something like, possibly my sweater is black, as let's have B be my sweater is black, and now I can put the possibility operator in front. And this is going to give me a different sentence than just B on its own. Similarly, if I want to say necessarily if I exist, then I'm human, cool. We stick the box in front, and then we build a conditional that says if Nathan exists, then Nathan's human. And if I want to say if Socrates is human, then he's necessarily human, well, let's have Socrates is human as S, and I can get if S, then box S. So I highlight these three to highlight some relevant things about the grammar. We can stitch these operators onto atoms. We can stitch them onto the front of complex sentences, but we can also embed them in complex sentences. Again, just like negation. So it works in that same kind of grammar way. But importantly, what do these sort of mean? Well, again, the diamond means it's possible that, and the box means it's necessary that. But in a sense, it's helpful for us, if we're just doing the logic, to not really think too much about what it says. Don't try and think about, okay, necessarily possible that A. Just read it as the operators. It'll be a little bit easier. Suggestion. You don't have to, but it's a suggestion. Okay, so again, coming back, we have this idea of expressions of ML. It's any of those collections of symbols. What are this? Yeah.
But that ever happened? The boxes in the diamond?
Oh yeah.
Why?
Good. We're going to come to it. I promise. So you might, just as a promissory note, something you might be interested in is, right, okay, it's possible for Rob, say, to run 25 miles an hour. But is it possibly possible? Right? Is it from every given situation, or better, this is necessarily possible, from every given situation, could we get to a situation where Rob is running 25 miles an hour? Take a world where, right, we don't have any technology. We're all just cavemen living and banging around, killing dinosaurs, whatnot. Right? Is it still possible that Rob could run 25 miles an hour? That looks a lot weirder. Well, I'm not sure. But no, what we're already thinking about is jumping to that situation, could we then get to another situation where Rob's doing something? So there's two possibility steps in the way. This is something really interesting. And these are the kinds of weird, silly philosophical questions that are going to come up. Cool, we can get there from here. But if we went over there, could we still get there? This is why we start to worry about iterated modalities. Putting the boxes and diamonds, stacking them up. Leads to new questions. Okay, so again, spooling back, right? We've got our basic concept of an expression. So what's the grammatical rules? Oh, big scary box coming, but don't freak out about it, right? This should be very familiar, right? It's basically the sentence construction rules for TFL, just with two extra clauses. So this is ML's sentence construction rules. This is the grammatical rules for this language. It's really easy, right? Every atom is an atomic sentence. If you have a sentence, you can stick a negation in front of it. If you have two sentences, then you can stick a conjunction, a disjunction, a conditional, or a biconditional in between them. Again, those should all be familiar. 1 through 6, that's literally copy-pasted from TFL's sentence construction rules. The only thing that's different are 7 and 8. 7 tells us if you have a sentence, you can put a box in front of it. And 8 tells us if you have a sentence, you can put a diamond in front of it. And 9, the best clause, my favorite clause, fuck off if you don't like it. These are the rules. If you don't fit any of these, you don't get to play.
Can we do nothing else in sentence?
Either way is fine. So one of the things sometimes here it's useful to talk about formula instead of sentences in line with FOL. Doesn't matter. So, notably, 7 and 8 tell us something. Again, this is why 7 and 8 allow for us to end up in these sorts of situations. It's not like if you get box A, you can't then just feed it right back into the sentence construction rules and do stuff to it. So this is grammatical, and because it's grammatical, we'll need to figure out what it means in some sense. Yeah?
Something is not possible, even using negation and then a box and then a sentence.
Yeah, that's what we're going to talk about. Right? That's what we're going to get to. So this is just, again, kind of running up with the grammar rules. And we'll move on to like, how do we actually use this to say some of the stuff we want to say? But yes, if it's not possible, not possible, P. Nice. Yeah.
Can you only use modal logic with TFL, or do they also use it with FOL?
You can use it with FOL, but it gets very ugly very quickly. So this is me doing everybody a solid. We're just playing it with TFL. The hope is maybe eventually in later iterations to get to that, but it's very complicated very quickly. But yes. Note that if we did this with FOL, it's going to look very similar, but we're going to have to say things about, again, this is why we use formula here, we'll have to say things about how we do the interplay between names and the quantifiers and these, and the big issue is going to be how to understand domains. But that's for another day. So, again, this is our basic kind of sentence construction rules for ML. And using this, we can now start to express a bunch of things. We can finally logically express claims like possibly my sweater's black. We have the tools. There's one problem with ML. I know, I'm sorry. The big problem with ML, actually I'm going to go back a couple slides to point it out. Can anybody guess what the big issue is here? Maybe let's flip it. What was the really lovely thing about truth functional logic? What was the beautiful tool that you used? Truth tables. Truth tables. So the nice thing about truth tables is that it's very mechanical, right? It's literally just, hey, if we know how to fill in the tables, we can figure everything out. And the reason that works is because, the clue's in the name, it's a truth functional logic. Everything in the language, go back one more slide, everything in TFL, that is everything other than this stuff, is truth functional. These operators are not truth functional. So once we introduce them into our language, we can no longer use tables. Because we can't use tables to make sense of claims featuring these. Which makes sense. Because remember, what are tables tables of? We talked about this, I think, 2 weeks ago, right? They're collections of valuations. Ascriptions of truth values to atomic sentences. Basically, they're situations where things are actually true. But that's never going to give us the stuff we're interested in, because we want to know what could or must be.
Aren't truth tables then a collection of possibilities?
They are. But note, what we don't really have is any operator that talks about, like, all the rows of a table.
Do you use them with symbols to say, or to reduce the whole table to maybe one sentence?
It just unfortunately doesn't work. Because if we do it, if we play around with the tables to make these work, then they're not going to work for these other connectives anymore. It's a sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. You can make a system that gives you this stuff, but then it's not really going to let you truth functionally assess these. And in fact, when I'm talking about interpretations, the stuff we're going to do next week, it's designed to help us make sense of these. This is, again, why we can't just use tables for it. We have to use a slightly different mechanism. It's a good question, but yeah, it sucks.
Yeah, so especially without the model operators, you can just put in
It'll work just like TFL. Again, the nice thing here is that it is TFL, just with these two things bolted on. So, okay, that brings us to natural deduction. So what I want to do before, we'll go quickly through 2 points about this, then we'll take our break, and then we'll come back and talk about the rest. So natural deduction for ML. We're going to have 4 systems. And there are 4 different systems because effectively there are 4 different rules, or clusters of rules. So much like before, with natural deduction, we'll use the single turnstile. Right? The single turnstile says provability. This tells us there's some proof that starts with A1 through AN as assumptions and ends in C. Now, because we're going to have different natural deduction systems for ML, we're not going to have just this single turnstile unadorned. It's going to have subscripts. And these subscripts basically tell us what rules are you allowed to use. The neat thing is that they stack. So the rules we'll learn for K, which is the first system we're going to do, you can also use them in T, in S4, and S5. And everything in S4 you can use in S5. So basically these are stronger systems as you go up. It does mean, though, if, for example, I ask you to prove something in T, there'll be rules from here that you won't be able to use. And we're going to come at this just thinking about it purely in terms of natural deduction. But the underlying thought here behind these different systems we'll be able to cash out next week. Super roughly, it's tied in with the idea of whether possible situations can see each other. How well they can see each other. That's what we'll talk about next week. But right now, let's just think about it purely in terms of what are the moves permissible in the game. You can think about them as like, this is super basic Dungeons & Dragons, this is the advanced rules, this is 3.0, and this is 3.5. And much like 3.5, this one is way too powerful. Wizards are broken. Okay. So, this means we got to be careful. Pay attention to the subscript on the little single turnstile here, right? Pay attention to the subscript. We'll make it very clear on the exams and stuff, but note you've got to note it down too. So our first system, K, is named for Saul Kripke, who didn't quite come up with it, but he proved the soundness and completeness of it. And it has 3 basic rules. The first basic rule is everything that you know how to do with TFL natural deduction works here. So all this stuff we've been talking about the last couple weeks works here too. The other 2 basic rules, we're going to have modal ponens, and necessitation. So let's talk about these 2 basic rules, and then we'll come back and talk about the derived rules. But note again, for a K, every natural deduction rule we've actually used so far works. The other 2 we add on, modal ponens and necessitation. So let's talk about modal ponens first. MP. MP says, if you have a necessitated conditional, if you have box conditional, and you have a necessitated version of the antecedent, box A in this case, then you can derive the necessitated consequent. So here's the idea. If you know that a conditional is necessarily true, right? if you know that necessarily if A then B, and you find out that A is also necessarily true, well then you know that the consequent has to be necessarily true as well. And it makes sense. Again, let's read the boxes. It's true in every situation. It must be true. Well, if the conditional must be true, then we know that there can be no situation where the antecedent's true and the consequence false. Because if there was even one situation, then the conditional would not be necessarily true. So that's what M gives us. Then we find out, hey, the antecedent's true. Well, based on what we just said, that means it must not be possible for the consequent to be false, i.e., it must be true. Because if there was even one situation, then it would be possible for the antecedent to be true and the consequent false, which would then make the conditional false. So again, if we have the necessitated conditional and the necessitated antecedent, we get the necessitated consequent. Make sense?
Why doesn't this work for a normal A? So if the conditional is necessarily true, why, if we can find A,
Good. We could get B,
but
not box B, because we're not sure that A is true in every possible situation, right? Because how could this conditional be true? Well, all it needs is just that there's no situation where antecedent's true and consequence false. Doesn't say anything about the cases where the antecedent's false. In those cases, B could be false. That's why we have to have the box. It's a good question. Okay, so this is our first one, MP. Again, note that MP gives us from two boxes, from two boxed claims, it gives us another boxed claim. So the second basic rule is necessitation. Necessitation is if you have a theorem, then you can box it. But notably, the way that it has to work is that you need to be able to literally prove that the thing is a theorem. So this means there is one new thing that we have not been able to do that you can do in ML. And that's, you can open a subproof with no assumptions whatsoever. So if you remember, in all of the natural deductions we've done so far, whenever we're opening a subproof, we always had to have something at the beginning. In this case, you don't. You have a line that's numbered with nothing there. And the idea is that what you're going to do in the subproof is only cite stuff in the subproof. It's literally going to be, imagine I had nothing at all. I could still magic up A. And because from nothing at all I can get A isn't just true, but it must be so. Again, we can kind of think about it. Let's go back. Remember what we said. What are some examples of logical necessities? Tautologies, logical truths. Remember what I said last lecture. There's a very cool connection between being a theorem and being a tautology. What was the connection? Do we remember? I'll help you out. Every sentence that is a theorem is a tautology and vice versa. Being a tautology and being a theorem are basically the same thing. Just one of them is from our natural deduction system, and one of them is from our truth-table system.
How do we prove that A is a theorem?
Good. How do we prove that A is a theorem? Do we remember? We talked about that last week too.
We create a subproof with no assumptions in which the conclusion is A.
Yeah. We bootstrap it from nothing. This one, for example, we could very easily prove that this is a theorem. And we could prove that not just is this conditional true, but it's necessarily true. We can do it this way. We start off with nothing at all, and our first assumption is going to be A. Now what? If I want to get this sentence, what could we do at line 2?
Reiterate A.
And now what can we do at line 3? We can get A conditional A, right? By conditional introduction. And we cite 1 through 2. Now take this, basically, what we're saying. Right? If you can prove that something's a theorem, you can take this proof that you just constructed and you can embed it in bigger proofs. Note that the numbers here aren't right. They have to be written over here. But again, you can see conceptually the point. And then we'll be able to go, cool, since I bootstrapped this from nothing at all, we can use necessitation to give us the box. So again, what's the reasoning here? What's the rationale? The rationale is that if we can show a sentence is a theorem, that its truth doesn't depend on anything at all, then we can conclude that it must be true. Yeah.
So the A in line N, does that symbolize the subproof in 1 and 2?
Good. So note that the A in line N is in my sexy swash font, so it's basically whatever you can get there. Right? In this case, it's going to be this condition.
The whole thing, or 1?
No, so it's just that sentence, right? It's basically, this is telling us to use necessitation, you need to be able to give me a subproof that starts from nothing and ends in some sentence.
You need to prove that that's a theorem first, right?
That's what you're doing in here. That's what this is proving. Right? The subproof that starts with nothing and ends with A is proving, sexy swash font A, is proving that sexy swash font A is a theorem.
Without doing the whole thing, you can show.
Well, again, this would need to be in there, right? These are schematic. So there could be a whole lot of steps in between M and N, but that'd be real hard to write up on my slide. So I just need to give you the schematic presentation. If you can prove that sexy swash font A is a theorem, you know that it doesn't depend on anything, so you can then conclude it's not just true, it's necessarily true. The big thing with this, though, when you use necessitation, is that whatever you do in the subproof cannot use anything outside of the subproof. It needs to be as if this was done completely separate and then copy-pasted in. Because if it uses anything, that it hasn't shown that what you've got is in fact a theorem. Okay, so these two are the new rules. That's it. These are it. And from them, we're able to do everything in K. Now, I want to stress, again, the motivation for thinking about this is to try and track down or make sense of or logically express claims using possibility and necessity. Claims about what could be true, what must be true. And it turns out that it's very difficult to come up with logical tools that accurately track these. These are our first little forays here. We stress again also, it is hard and weird if you haven't thought about it before. That's all right. We're going to go through it nice and slow and try and make sense of it. So don't panic. That's the big thing. Okay, so it's 11:42. Should we take a break, a 10-minute break?
What is the meaning of necessity and motivation?
Good. We'll talk about it in just a second. So let's take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 52, and we'll talk more about this stuff.
Ja,
Nou.
Je zou het